All right. What's up, everybody? Thanks for clicking this video. Thanks for tuning into my channel. My name is Simon Hill, Black American from Louisiana, coming to you live from Budapest, Hungary. The time where I'm at right now is 9:22 p.m., and it is January 5th, 2025. And today we are continuing our Book to React series by reading this new book for our saga. It's titled White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th-Century South, written by Martha Hodes. Now, this is a book that I've been waiting to read for a long time. I discovered this book by chance, like 3, 4, 5 months ago. I forgot exactly when. It's been on my hard drive for a long time, and I've been waiting to read this book because this is not some fan fiction. This is not sex talk. This is not, somebody who does not have the bona fides to be writing a book like this. This is real, true history written by a real storied scholar. So before we read anything, let's give a shout out to the comments. Ozzy is in the comments. He says, this is going to be interesting. It surely will be. I promise you it will. And yeah, let's go. Before we read anything, we always read about the author. You never pick up a book, if you can, without doing some background search on who wrote this thing. So the person who wrote this book is a woman named Martha Hodes. She is a white woman, as you can see. She was born on June 12, 1958. She's 66 years old. Her education, she has a bachelor's that she earned in 1980 from Baldwin College. She has a master's from Harvard University in 1984. She has a PhD from Princeton University. Her thesis was Sex Across the Color Line, White Women and Black Men in the 19th Century American South. So essentially, this book is how she earned her thesis. So let's read a bit about her biography. This is a short one here on the Wikipedia page for Martha Hodes, but I have a longer biography that we will read soon. So Martha Hodes, born June 12, 1958, is an American historian. She is a professor of history at New York University currently, and the author of several books. She won the Lincoln Prize in 2016. Well, more on the Lincoln Prize later. So Hodes was born in 1958, as they said. At the age of 12, she was taken hostage with her sister and hundreds of other people as part of the hijacking of TW-8 Flight 741 in September 1970. She and the rest of the hostages were eventually released. She earned her Bachelor's of Arts from Baldwin College, her Master's from Harvard, and her PhD from Princeton. Here are some of her other books right here. I'm interested in reading The Sea Captain's Wife. That's another book that she wrote as well that I also have on my hard drive. Let's go to the Lincoln Prize. Once again, this woman here, Martha Hodes, who wrote this book about sex between Black men and white women in the South before the end of slavery, is not somebody to play with. She won the Lincoln Prize, the Gilder Lerman Lincoln Prize, founded by late Richard Gilder and Louis Lerman in partnership with Gabor Borit, Director Emeritus of the Civil War Institute at Gettysburg College, is administered by the Gilder Lerman Institute of American History. It has been awarded annually since 1991 for the finest scholarly work in English on Abraham Lincoln, the American Civil War, or American Civil War era. The laureates, the prize has been split equally between two entries on 6 occasions: 1992, 2000, 2008, 2009, 2012, and 2014. Recipients of the $50,000 prize have included these people. And when was Martha Hodes the winner? Martha Hodes won this award in 2016 for her book, Mourning Lincoln. So once again, for any of the people who are going to come in later to my live streams or stories and say, oh, this person doesn't know what they're talking about, or this book is BS and stuff like that. This woman is a well-known and distinguished scholar in her field. Let's learn more about Martha Hodes right here, her full biography. I promise you we're going to get into the book, I promise you, but this is for all the people that will come later. So Martha Hodes is a fellow here at this institute. On the website, you can click the link in the description. She was a fellow awarded in 2018, and her field of study is U.S. history. As a historian and a writer, Martha Hodes has devoted her career to reconstructing the lives of ordinary people facing adverse circumstances, ranging from risk and fear to ostracism and grief, to violence and death. Her work relies on intensive archival research in order to weave the lives of her protagonists into deep historical context context presented to readers through compelling narrative. She's a professor of history at New York University. Hodes is the author most recently of Mourning Lincoln, winner of the Lincoln Book Prize, awarded by the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, and the Avery O'Craven Prize, awarded by the Organization of American Historians. Mourning Lincoln was named an editor's choice in the New York Times Book Review, a best book of the year by the Wall Street Journal, and one of the 10 long list finalists for the National Book Awards. Hodes is also the author of 2 more award-winning books, The Sea Captain's Wife, A True Story of Love, Race, and War in the 19th Century, and White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th-Century South. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships, including for the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Dorothy and Lewis B. Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library, the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History at Harvard University, the Fulbright Commission, the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, and the Whiting Foundation. She has served as scholar in residence at the John F. Kennedy Institute for North American Studies at the Free University of Berlin, and has presented her scholarship nationally and internationally at colleges and universities, high schools, elementary schools, museums, and historical societies, national parks, and literary festivals. At New York University, Hodes teaches courses on race, the Civil War, and the 19th century United States, as well as courses devoted to the arts and craft of history writing, including history and storytelling, reconstructing lives, biography as history, autobiography and history, and reading and writing experimental history. She is a winner of NYU's Golden Dozen Award for Teaching Excellence. Hodes holds degrees from Baldwin College, Harvard University, and Princeton, and is an elected lifetime fellow of the Society of American Historians, an organization devoted to distinguished historical writing. With the support of the Guggenheim Foundation, Martha Hodes will write a book exploring history and memory through a 1970 airplane hijacking, in which she was a 12-year-old passenger held hostage in the Jordan Desert for a week. So that's the information. Once again, for all the people out here who are going to say, Simon just be reading books about bullshit. Simon don't know what he's talking about. Simon just be reading anything. We are reading things from distinguished scholars, the best of American historians, and the best of American historians have said, without doubt, that Black men were serving BBC to white women before slavery ended. Applaud our ancestors, brothers. Applaud our ancestors. Pogging was a thing, okay? Ozzy says, I wonder if she got a Black husband. Great question. Great question, because 99.9% of the time, the only people that love Black people are the ones who sleep with Black people. Unfortunately, the only people that tend to care about Black issues tend to have some Black pussy on the side or a Black dick on their mind. Let's keep it a buck. I'm keeping it absolutely real. She does not have a Black husband from my research. I looked that up. It looks like she's married to a white man, which to me makes her an even better person. You don't have no Black man in your life. You're not married to Black folks, but you are interested in our history and our culture and our experience. That makes it even better in my mind. You get what I'm saying? So no, from my understanding, but you can look it up and find out more about Martha Hodes. I don't know. I didn't. And number one, I don't even care, because it's not about what type of dick or pussy that she likes. It's about, the story, because I'm here for the book, not for what she does in the sheets. Okay. So that's Martha Hodes. That's a lot of background on Martha Hodes. I have this other link here, but let's get to the book now. Now you can find this book on Amazon, and I recently have a huge Amazon haul of books that I ordered that are coming to the house almost every single day, right? You can find this book on Amazon for the humble price of only $24 in paperback, $23 hardcover. Now let me give you some background information on this book that has 57 reviews and 4.3 stars. Okay, so a lot of people like this book. You get what I'm saying? Okay. Ozzy says maybe she getting BBC on the side. Maybe. Who knows? Maybe she was experimenting at Baldwin or Harvard or Princeton. Who knows? Either way, the point is the book might be fire. So let's go here and read about this book. Before we jump into it, I promise you, I'm just giving background. So this award-winning book is the first to explore the history of a powerful category of illicit sex in America's past, liaisons between Southern white women and Black men. Martha Hodes tells a series of stories about such liaisons in the years before the Civil War, explores the complex ways in which white Southerners tolerated them in the slave South, and shows how and why these responses changed with emancipation. Hodes provides details of the wedding of a white servant woman and a slave man in 1681, an antebellum rape accusation that uncovered a relationship between an unmarried white woman and a slave, and a divorce plea from a white farmer based on an adulterous affair between his wife and a neighborhood slave. Drawing on sources that include courtroom testimony, legislative petitions, pardon pleas, and congressional testimony, she presents the voices of the authorities, eyewitnesses, and the transgressors themselves. And these voices seem to say that in the slave South, whites were not overwhelmingly concerned about such liaisons, beyond the racial and legal status of the children that were produced. Only with the advent of Black freedom did the issue move beyond neighborhood dramas and into the arena of politics, becoming a much more serious taboo than it had ever been before. Hodes gives vivid examples of the violence that followed the upheaval of war when Black men and white women were targeted by the Ku Klux Klan, and unprecedented white rage and terrorism against such liaisons began to erupt. An era of terror and lynching was inaugurated, and the legacy of these sexual politics lingered well into the 20th century. So that's a synopsis of the book. So now that we've laid down the biography of the author, now that we have a synopsis of the book, let's jump into the story, fellas. Let's jump into the story. White Women, Black Men, Illicit Sex in the 19th Century South, written by Martha Hodes. Scrolling through here. This was published by Yale University Press. I mean, you do not get published by one of the most distinguished universities in America unless your academics, unless your scholarship is thorough. This book was published in 1997, as you can see right here, from Yale University Press. Okay, here are the contents right here. Only about 8 chapters or so. So quite a thin book. Okay, not that long. We have some acknowledgements here that we're going to read through a little bit. You know what? We'll skip through the acknowledgements because she's just saying thanks to everybody that helped her along the way. Okay. For now, I think her husband is this guy here named Bruce Dorsey. For anybody wondering if Martha Hodes has a white or Black husband, I think Bruce Dorsey, this guy here, and you can look him up or do more research. I found that Bruce Dorsey is a white male historian. So I think that might be who her boyfriend or husband is. Anyway, let's go here. First part. White women, Black men having sex before slavery. Let's go. Telling the stories. A history of sex between white women and Black men in the 19th century American South is also the history of a powerful category of illicit sex in the United States. When in 1967, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled the laws prohibiting marriage between people of different races were unconstitutional, 16 states had such laws. Decades later, the legacy of this history remains evident, notably in the modern-day annals of white violence in both North and South. Researching this book, I never found whole stories in the archives. Rather, I found shards and bones, parts of conversations, and laconic responses to frightening questions. Sometimes I wondered, why not write a work of fiction on the same subject? Why was I compelled to write history, to not just tell a story, but a true story? Why was I compelled to write history, to not just tell a story, but a true story? In fiction, I could have dispensed with documentation and freely invoked imagination. But as I continued my research, I understood why I could not have undertaken this book as a work of fiction. As I began to write the history of sex between white women and Black men in the 19th century South, I realized I had found stories that did not conform to what I had anticipated. This was a narrative that had to be told first as history. All right, and I'm glad she didn't write it as fiction because, we don't need any more erotic interracial sex fan fiction on Amazon. No, we want history. We want to learn about our past. The historical development of white anxiety. White anxiety about sex between white women and Black men is not a timeless phenomenon in the United States. Rather, it is a historical development that evolved out of a particular social, political, and economic circumstance. Scholars agree that the most virulent racist ideology about Black male sexuality emerged in the decades that followed the Civil War, and some historians have recognized that the lynching of black men for the alleged rape of white women was comparatively rare in the South under slavery. This book explains how whites in the antebellum South responded when confronted with sexual liaisons between white women and black men, and how and why those responses changed with emancipation. Under the institution of racial slavery, I argue, white Southerners could respond to sexual liaisons between white women and black men with a measure of toleration. Only with black freedom did such liaisons begin to provoke a near inevitable alarm, one that culminated in the tremendous white violence of the 1890s and after. Two of the nation's foremost black activists, Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells, called attention to this transition as it occurred before their eyes in the post-Civil War South. Both observed that the accusation of rape of white women by black men was relatively uncommon in the slave South, as well as during the Civil War, when white men were absent from Southern homes. The crime to which the Negro is now said to be so generally and especially addicted, stated Douglass at the height of the lynching era in 1892, is one of which he has been heretofore seldom accused or supposed to be guilty. Basically, what Frederick Douglass is saying here, and also what Martha is saying here, is that when we were enslaved, white men weren't just running around saying, hey, that black man raped a white woman. It wasn't until after we got free, all of a sudden now black men want to rape white women. And we also have to remember during slavery, right, we weren't literally in chains. They didn't have us chained up all the time. They had us in mental slavery and had the society condition for us to be totally enslaved. So black people could walk around freely. You would hear stories about slaves being sent to go to another master's plantation and walk for miles. You wouldn't be able to track him or keep him totally in chains or totally monitored, right? So black men were moving freely throughout the South. And white men didn't just accuse every black man of raping white women, but it wasn't until we all got free that this sort of became the common thing. Anyway, continuing here. So, or as Ida B. Wells told her listeners the same year, the world knows that the crime of rape was unknown during 4 years of Civil War, when the white women of the South were at the mercy of the race, which is all at once charged with being a bestial one. Although white people in North America had professed beliefs about the greater sexual ardor of black men ever since the colonial era, and although black men had been accused and convicted of raping white women within the racist legal system of the slave South, Wells and Douglass were nonetheless correct that those ideas and inequalities did not include relentless, deadly violence toward black men before the late 19th century. Sanctions against sex between white women and black men in the slave South must have accounted in part for the infrequency of such liaisons. Yet my concern is not to point out that sex between white women and black men occurred with a particular frequency. Rather, my concern is to demonstrate that when such liaisons did occur, white Southerners could react in a way that complicates modern assumptions. Statistics are difficult to gather in part because sex between white women and black men did not enter the historical record under a uniform heading. Antebellum legal records do not employ any one word to define the particular transgression. The word miscegenation was invented during the Civil War, and until then, liaisons between white women and black men went on record as a result of other crimes or legal disputes. Given the laws against marriage between blacks and whites, such liaisons could be prosecuted as fornication or adultery. If children were produced, the protagonist would be guilty of bastardy as well. I didn't even know that was a crime, bastardy. Yet white women and white men were also routinely charged with fornication, adultery, and bastardy, demonstrating that Southern authorities did not simply target liaisons between white women and black men under the name of other sex crimes. A liaison between a white woman and a black man could also be revealed through rape charges, further clouding the possibility of straightforward statistics. Other liaisons entered the record under civil and criminal categories unrelated to sex crimes, including illegal enslavement, contested inheritance, libel, slander, and murder. Moreover, testimony in all such cases often made it clear that white neighbors had known about a liaison before, and often years before it was revealed in a legal document, and therefore in the public record for some other reason. For every liaison that unfolded in a county courtroom, there must have been others. It is impossible to say how many in the antebellum South that never entered the record. So basically, of course, it's impossible to count, during slavery, how many white women had sex with black men. But what she's saying is like, at that time, having a child out of wedlock was a crime. Committing adultery or fornicating, just having premarital sex, was a crime. So if there was a difference in how black men and white men were treated for these crimes, then they would have counted that, right? If you look through those records. But you don't see that. So that goes to show, that if this did happen, it wouldn't have been considered some other aberration of the law, right? And there are other ways of finding out if black men had sex with white women. All right. Ozzy says, makes sense. Once black men were free, white men felt intimidated. I agree. I absolutely agree with that, Ozzy. I mean, yeah, now they had to not only compete economically, they had to compete sexually against black men for, the affections of white women. And their response to that was to make laws prohibiting black men from freely choosing partners. All right. Continuing here. White responses to liaisons between white women and black men differed markedly from the permissiveness displayed for sex between white men and black women, which most often involved the rape of female slaves by masters or other white men. Antebellum Southerners and their historians have written about the tacit acceptance on the parts of whites for this phenomenon of slave society. Fugitive slave Harriet Jacobs told readers of her 1861 memoir that if the white parent is the father instead of the mother, the offspring are unblushingly reared for the market. Basically, if a white man has sex with a black woman during slavery, that child is essentially going to be a slave, always going to be a slave. Plantation mistress Mary Chestnut wrote in a now famous diary entry of 1861 that every lady tells you who is the father of all the mulatto children in everybody's household, but those in her own she seems to think dropped from the clouds. That sex between white women and black men did not necessarily provoke white violence by no means implies its sanguine acceptance. There is a crucial nuance of language here. Tolerance implies a liberal spirit toward those of a different mind. Toleration, by contrast, suggests a measure of forbearance for that which is not approved. I use the term toleration to describe in part white attitudes towards sexual liaisons between white women and black men in the slave South. Yet the phenomenon of toleration, no matter how carefully defined, cannot convey the complexity of responses. White neighbors judged harshly, gossiped viciously, and could completely ostracize the transgressing white woman. Once you go black, you never go back. Once you go black, you never go back. As for the black man, it was the lack of sure violence that is historically significant, and this is difficult imperative terrain. The evidence yielded striking absences, and absences are harder to interpret than their more tangible opposites. If a degree of local indifference is apparent at certain points in the stories that follow, the narratives also demonstrate that white toleration was mediated by limits of both patriarchy and class. First, male authority and honor in white families and communities was a crucial component of the slave South, and patriarchal patience for illicit sex on the part of white girls and women was not forthcoming under any circumstances. More specifically, Southern lawmakers had written statutes so that sex between white women and black men confounded the system of racial slavery and had entirely different consequences from sex between white men and black women. In the antebellum South, a child's legal status as slave or free followed the mother. If your mother was free, you were free. If your mother was a slave, you were a slave. Sexual liaisons between white women and black men therefore threatened racial slavery in a way that sex between white men and black women did not. When white women had children with black men, two important social categories were eroded. Racial categories were eroded because the children would be of mixed European and African ancestry, and categories of slavery and freedom were eroded because free people of African ancestry endangered the equation of blackness and slavery. The possibility of white toleration for sex between white women and black men in the slave South sheds light on patriarchal power within white households and its crucial connections to the institution of racial slavery. Second, Class boundaries played a role in white responses to sexual liaisons between white women and black men. The white population of the antebellum South ranged from wealthy plantation owners who commanded large slave labor forces to work their substantial land holdings to yeoman farmers who strove for economic self sufficiency, perhaps assisted by a modicum of slave labor, to poor whites who owned no slaves and little or no land. The economic status of any one family, especially outside the planter classes, might rise or fall over time with, for example, the purchase of a slave or the loss of property to debtors. The upcountry regions of the South were largely, though not exclusively, home to yeoman farmers and poor whites, while in low country, tidewater, and black belt areas, small slaveholders and non-slaveholders coexisted with masters of large plantations. Distinct social tensions governed interaction among white Southerners of different classes. Such struggles can also be found in the stories of white women and black men narrated in these pages. Specifically, dominant ideas about poor white women included convictions about their promiscuity and debauchery that could mitigate blame of a black man. As Neil Irvin Painter points out, the stereotypes are centuries old and have their origins in European typecasting of both the poor and the black, for sex is the main theme associated with poverty and with blackness. And as Victoria E. Bynum writes, poverty defeminized white women much as race defeminized black women. In the dominant visions of the antebellum South, then black women seduced white men, and poor white women were capable of seducing black men. I mean, we have to remember, as black men, of course, we still exist under a system of patriarchy, right? And so we have advantages as men over women, right? And so, she's saying here that essentially a lot of women were punished for having sex outside of marriage or committing adultery, even against men that were black, right? And there are definite records of women getting punished, but if there were black men who were, the adulterous partner with them or the fornicating partner with them, we're not sure exactly what happened, right? And that could mean that violence happened towards them or that nothing happened to them at all, or they got a slap on the wrist, right? Because as men, we get the benefit of the doubt of that. Also, poverty as well. I mean, class plays a part of this. So there might have been poor white women who were not a part of these slave holding elites, right? Or a poor family that might have had one slave, right? So they're not that wealthy, who might have been sleeping with black male slaves, right? And that's like a cross section of class. And these poor white women, even in the relation of slavery, right, could still have some disadvantage in the presence of a man, even if that be a black man, right? So yeah, that's what I'm getting from that. Continuing here, my mama loves me, y'all. Anyway, sorry about that. So the dangers of a liaison across the color line was graver for black men and elite white women because those women were at the center of white Southern ideas about female purity. Legal records concerning sex between white women and black men largely, although not uniformly, relay stories about white women outside the planter classes. It is difficult to know whether this was due to the greater surveillance of planter class women by their families or whether it reflected the ability of wealthier white women and their families to keep sexual transgressions out of court and therefore out of the historical record. Dominant ideas about the sexuality of black men and white women were closely bound up with ideas about the sexual depravity of black women. All of these ideas were part of a system that ideally would permit white men to control all white women and all black people. The sexual abuse of black women by white men was the most extensive and gruesome component of this system. Third, the legal status of slave men as the property of white people and the potential of free black men to become property or to be treated as such meant that white Southerners had a stake in protecting their human chattel from extreme violence or murder. White concerns about the preservation of slave property could therefore check violent reactions to a sexual transgression between a white woman and a black man. The end of slavery also meant the end of property concerns and thus helps to explain the disintegration of restraints and the shift toward extreme white violence. In the decades following emancipation, with the demise of slavery as a rough dividing line between black and white, the total separation of black people and white people became essential for whites who hoped to retain white supremacy. White ideas about the dangers of black male sexuality were not newly formed after the Civil War, but white virulence reached a greater intensity with the transition from black slavery to black freedom. Beginning in the Reconstruction era, black men were terrorized and often murdered, and white women were subjected to extreme abuse if they engaged or allegedly engaged in sexual liaisons across the color line. Furthermore, white Southerners explicitly conflated black men's alleged sexual misconduct toward white women with the exercise of their newly won political rights. Frederick Douglass and Ida B. Wells understood this phenomenon. Douglass directly equated accusations of sexual transgressions against white women with black men's newfound political power. It is only since the Negro has become a citizen and a voter, he wrote in 1892, that this charge has been made. Lynching, Wells wrote early in the 20th century, was wholly political, its purpose being to suppress the colored vote by intimidation and murder. So basically, also what they're trying to say, once again, going back to the point that during slavery, black men were not so widely accused of raping white women and all that sort of stuff. Partially, it's because white men had an interest in maintaining the social order, the patriarchy with them on top, black men being subordinate to them, black women being subordinate to white men and black men, and also white women being subordinate to them, and the preservation of their property. They don't want to, hurt their slaves. So even if a black man did rape a white woman, the idea wouldn't be to just kill him or lynch him. But after the end of slavery and we gained our freedom, white men are now competing with black men for jobs. And also there's depressed economic activity for white men. And also black people have gained political rights. We can vote. So the lynching of black men accused of raping white women was just to have political warfare against black people, to get rid of them in the voting booth, right? But hey, there are some black folks out there that think voting is not important. So let's remember that. White men killed our ancestors and fought tooth and nail to make sure we couldn't have the right to vote, all that sort of stuff. And they're fighting right now to keep us from voting. But hey, remember, voting is not important, guys. Anyway, I'm continuing here in the book. So, contradictions, crises, voices, language. My purpose here is not to prove the existence of simple white toleration for sex between white women and black men in the antebellum South. Rather, I seek to uncover and explain how some white communities responded when such liaisons came to light, and then to explore why. In the decades that followed emancipation, the majority of the white South became enraged about this particular category of illicit sex. Such explanations and explorations require a level of comfort and paradoxes. Indeed, all answers to questions about societies that operated under human bondage include paradoxes. In fact, although Southern laws made liaisons between white women and black men dangerous to the institution of racial slavery, there was a contradictory lack of action in the face of such liaisons. In the antebellum South, white women and black men who engaged in illicit sex did not uniformly suffer swift retribution. For under slavery, such liaisons did not sufficiently threaten the social and political hierarchy as they would after emancipation. The roots of this strained toleration lie in two contradictory but coexisting factors: the insignificance or such transgressions in the face of the power of racial slavery versus the explosive nature of those transgressions, also in the face of racial slavery. For whites to refrain from immediate legal action and public violence when confronted with liaisons between white women and black men helped them to mask some of the flaws of the antebellum Southern systems of race and gender. Very interesting point. Basically, what she's trying to say, if there were a lot of liaisons between black men and white women before the end of slavery, a lot of the rich plantation owners did not want that to come out. They did not want people knowing if their daughters, wives, cousins, whatever, the white women in their families were having sex with black men, because number one, you don't want the heat of the law on you. You also don't want to show that there are cracks in the system, right? How are you going to have all these beautiful black people out here and all these white people here, right? And there not be intermixing between them? For I thought you were saying that black people are not human. But if you're showing constantly that black people are human, we have the capacity to love and be loved, and also to reproduce people that can be born free, but they're not free because they came out of the father instead of the white mother, et cetera, et cetera. It shows that there are flaws in the slavery system, right? So they tried to keep this hidden, is essentially the argument she's trying to say. So Yet paradoxically, any toleration of such transgressions meant that those flaws would also be exposed, especially in the evidence of free children of partial African ancestry, the free children of white women and black men. Indeed, in all the antebellum cases reconstructed in this book, it was the presence of free children that precipitated a crisis that ultimately intruded on local reluctance to prosecute or violently persecute. In the first story, the crisis concerned the enslavement of the descendants of a colonial marriage between a white servant woman and a slave man. In the next story, the critical issue was the nature of the sex between a white servant woman and a slave man after the woman had given birth and claimed rape. In the third, the fate of a white marriage was at stake after the wife had borne the children of a slave. In the last two antebellum stories, whites were in a quandary over whether people who might be the sons of white mothers and black fathers should inherit property. In each of these antebellum cases, the presence of children forced the liaison into court. Once their testimony made it clear that whites had known about the liaison for quite some time. After that, the verdicts demonstrated that the law could tolerate a liaison between a white woman and a black man. The governor pardoned a black man initially convicted of rape, for example, and the legislature denied divorce to a white husband whose white wife had consorted with a black man. Double whammy. Black man gets free from prison, and a white man has to raise another nigga's kids. Double whammy. That's victory before the end of slavery. I swear, I love our people so much. We've achieved so much as a people. All right. From the point of view of the transgressors, rather than the authorities, the crises were very different. Yet there are fewer sources to determine those contours. Throughout the antebellum documents, the voices of white men come through most clearly as slaveholders, patriarchs, witnesses, jury members, and judges. Next clearest are the voices of the transgressing white women, followed by the transgressing black men, who often had no opportunity to defend themselves or wisely chose to remain silent. Documents occasionally include the voices of neighboring white women and black men as observers of the transgressors. Black women as mothers, wives, daughters, friends, or neighbors, undoubtedly, often suspected or knew about liaisons between white women and black men. And they unquestionably were affected by and held opinions about those liaisons. Yet black women's voices are the faintest in the antebellum historical record. Following emancipation, the crises for all parties centered on the transition from slavery to freedom. White Southerners became more and more alarmed at the consequences of Black freedom, and transgressors or alleged transgressors became increasingly fearful about the tremendous upsurge in white violence. The views of Black women, who were also subject to tremendous white violence after the war, are finally discernible in testimony taken against the Ku Klux Klan in the 1870s. By the 1890s, the voices of educated Black women formed a significant part of the growing protest against white violence. The concept of communities is illuminating in regard to which voices are audible in the historical record. Although the localities discussed in this book were home to blacks and whites whose lives were daily intertwined, sharp divisions of power also existed. The documents often, though not always, present Southern whites as living in a unified community, but that is only because select voices have been preserved. The phrases white community and white Southerners cannot therefore be wholly inclusive. For one thing, such phrases always exclude the transgressing white woman and any allies she may have had. For slave and free Black communities in the antebellum South, historians can only speculate about unified or dissenting voices on the topic of sex with white women. For the records are nearly entirely silent on this matter. Sources are also largely quiet on the place of a transgressing black man within his own community. So they're saying, like, here, what the community thought about the transgressing black man that had sex with the white woman while we were enslaved, there's not a lot of information there. Basically, what she's trying to say here is, like, when we read history, for the most part, we're reading the voices and stories and words of white men. Right. And this is why inclusion is important. This is why, it's important for Black people to be able to tell our stories and other marginalized people to tell their stories for the historical record. That's what she's trying to get at here. Anyway, sources are also largely quiet on the place of a transgressing Black man within his own community. In many ways, then, the safest use of the word community is simply as a means to talk about some of the people who live near one another. The boundaries of such an area would be as far as a person could travel in a day. Following from this understanding of intertwined white and black communities, the stories recounted here are also about problems of racial categorization for the descendants of white women and black men. If social and legal sanctions against sex between people of European ancestry and people of African ancestry had never existed, the categories black and white, as they are known and used today, would not exist either. W.E.B. Du Bois was among the first scholars to name and investigate this problem, partly through the mixture of Africa and Europe within his own family. More recently, Barbara J. Fields has eloquently supported the contention that race is a product of history, not of nature. My corresponding view of race as a social construction creates attendant problems of description. Fields sums up such problems when she observes the well-known anomaly of American racial convention that considers a white woman capable of giving birth to a black child, but denies that a black woman can give birth to a white child. In addition, Europe and Africa were not the sole categories, for some Southerners traced their ancestry to various combinations of American Indian, European, and African descent. In some of the stories that follow, all of these categories came into play in legal battles over marriage, freedom, and inheritance. I have used the terms black and white to denote people recognized locally as respectively African American and European American, and have placed those words in quotation marks only to express ambiguities of identification among the historical actors themselves. I have echoed the phrase person of color when it appears in the documents. I do not use mulatto except when quoting sources, a word whose origin and definitions are both pejorative and murky. I similarly do not use miscegenation, a word coined during the presidential campaign of 1864 by the Democratic Party in order to cast aspersions upon Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party. Neither do I use the term interracial because it implies fixed categories of race and therefore an overly natural quality to those categories. Basically, what she's setting up here, she's trying to explain her uses. This is something used in academia, right? Because, when you're writing a PhD thesis or like any academic paper, you have to explain the terms you're using. And black and white are not descriptions of real people. Like, these are not biological parts of our body. We are created to be black people in the social construct, right? White people are created. These are all social constructs. That's basically what she's trying to say here. In the face of these convictions, as Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham points out, to argue that race is a myth and that it is an ideological rather than a biological fact does not deny that ideology has real effects on people's lives. Indeed, in the stories presented here, blackness was not the only category that mattered. Ideas about whiteness, too, were important in the lives of transgressing white women, as well as in the lives of those who judged them. Whiteness in the slave South was every bit as much a constructed category as blackness, and the narratives presented in this book illuminate the ambiguities inherent in racial categorization. In the same way, constructions of gender mattered not only in the lives of the white women, but also in the lives of the black men. A final note on language: for liaisons that came to pass in the slave South, I have used only the first names of the protagonists because the last names of black men were seldom recorded. In post-emancipation documents, when black men's surnames begin to appear with greater frequency, I have shifted to the more conventional appellation. All right. Continuing on to the stories. All right. Ozzy says in the chat, damn, those white women love them some black men. All right. I mean, yeah, that's what we're going to see, man. So the stories that she talked about was like a white woman got pregnant by one of her slaves, which is a true story. So she says, we're going to find out more. Another one, a white woman had sex with a black man. And then when she gave birth to the baby, then she wants to holler rape. I guess she thought the baby might come out light skinned. That baby came out looking like Ray Charles, came out looking like Charles Barkley. Anyway, and yeah, I think she was also talking about another story. Basically, I think all of the stories she's going to talk about here are about basically like the poor whites. Mostly the poor whites were sleeping with the brothers. All right, that's what she's going to say. So, anyway, that's what I'm picking up so far, but let's find out in the book. So, the stories. In part one, I recreate individual liaisons between white women and black men in the South before the Civil War to illuminate the roots of the problems of sexual liaisons between white women and black men under slavery. In chapter two, I present a case that spans the 17th and 18th centuries. In chapters 3 and 4 and 5, I relate antebellum stories in which the historical actors discuss such topics as fornication, cohabitation, rape, bastardy, adultery, divorce, and domestic violence. Changes over time within the antebellum South undoubtedly affected white responses to sexual liaisons between white women and black men, intensifying criticism from Northern anti-slavery forces after 1830, coupled with the Virginia slave uprising led by Nat Turner in 1831, which convulsed the entire region, might well have restrained white forbearance. Yet the scattered nature of the source limits a definitive analysis of such a shift within the antebellum era, and in fact, the cases examined do not fit into before and after patterns. Records indicate that lynchings of black men for the alleged rape of white women increased beginning in the mid 1850s as white Southerners braced for sectional conflicts over the institution of slavery. Still, such extra legal violence remained far from inevitable in the decade before the war broke out. Transformations in white responses are most apparent in the evolution from black slavery to black freedom, and that is where I have focused my treatment of change over time. In the years during and after the Civil War, discussions about sex between white women and black men underwent a tremendous shift. In the slave South, people talked about such transgressions in their own communities, and documents tell largely of neighborhood dramas. With the outbreak of war, the demise of slavery, and the advent of black freedom, however, discussions about sex between white women and black men multiplied rapidly in the arenas of national political culture. The subject of sex between white women and black men could now be found with much greater frequency in, for example, government hearings in major Southern newspapers. Part two opens with the Civil War years in chapter 6. Here, the voices of black men become more audible on the subject of sex with white women, and the subject of sex between white women and black men enters national politics for the first time in a sustained manner. The era of Reconstruction is the focus of Chapter 7, with white Southerners conflating sexual transgressions and politics with increasing directness and constancy. In Chapter 8, I take the history through the last quarter of the century with the consolidation of white rage at sex between white women and black men. Here, the story will sound more familiar than anything that has come before, with the recurrence of white people lynching black men for the alleged rape of white women. A sexual liaison between a white woman and a black man was unlikely to be documented in any detail, and most references to such liaisons were brief and elusive, sometimes only a single line in a legal ledger. Hardly anyone wrote about such liaisons in letters or even in diaries, at least not in any detail, and never in the first person. Very occasionally, personal papers, letters and diaries, or published sources, memoirs of travelers' accounts, mention a sexual liaison between a black man and a white woman, but the reference is never more than a sentence or two and utterly lacking in detail. I thus selected cases for which there existed a considerable body of evidence, choosing to examine a small number of rich narratives for the pre-Civil War era, with each in-depth case study supported by numerous similar, though less well-documented scenarios. The chapters that rely on evidence from the Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction decades offer a large number of briefer accounts. The cases investigated for this book, then, are by no means exhaustive. Readers who wish to know how I discovered the narratives I have recreated may turn to Searching for Stories, a note on sources. Each of the pre-Civil War cases studies is documented primarily in legal records. As the historian Lawrence Stone has so aptly written, people hauled into court are almost by definition atypical, but the world that is so nakedly exposed in the testimony of witnesses need not be so. Safety, therefore, lies in examining the documents not so much for their evidence about the eccentric behavior of the accused, as for the light they shed on the life and opinions of those who happen to get involved in the incident in question. Basically, what he's trying to say here is like, if somebody's taken to court, if somebody's in trouble by the law, usually these are abnormal people. But when that person is then talking about their story, and you find out how they got to that point to be in jail or to be in a courtroom accused of having sex with a black man, you're going to find out more about the society that allowed that to happen or created the circumstances for that to happen, for her to do something so heinous, so wrong. Okay, continuing here. So, this description well captures my methods and intentions. Courtroom testimony or legislative petitions are often the only window into the lives of the transgressors, where judicial maneuverings matter to the protagonist and their adversaries. I have incorporated them into the narrative. After emancipation, the provenance of these sources shifts. Reconstruction era scenarios are grounded primarily in government investigations of the Ku Klux Klan, while cases in the 1880s and 1890s are found largely in newspapers, though also in some court proceedings. For the post-Reconstruction era, I have also invoked the writings of social commentators and activists, both black and white, on the newly urgent topics of rape and lynching. A word about geography is also in order. The first story told here takes place in the colony of Maryland, in the region of earliest contact between Europeans and Africans in what would become the United States. The succeeding antebellum case studies takes place in North Carolina, Virginia, and Georgia. The Civil War, Reconstruction, and post-Reconstruction documents encompass more of the South as a whole. Together, all the narratives, including the many supporting stories told within the major case studies, comprise a wide range of geographical areas, from the mountains and upcountry to the coast and the Cotton Belt, although overall they favor states of the Upper South. As any resident, traveler, or scholar knows, there has never been a monolithic South, and both the contours of Southern society and the institution of slavery differed considerably in different localities. At the same time, important communities, important commu- sorry, at the same time, important continuities are apparent in the various stories I uncovered. And in light of those continuities, as well as the scarcity of documents the scarcity of documents about sex between white women and black men, I chose to undertake a study that encompasses different parts of the South rather than one that scrutinizes a smaller region in greater detail. I've also chosen to omit South Carolina and Louisiana from this study. Why? Why? Let Louisiana, we were getting booty too. We were smacking big pog booties in the South during slavery. Come on now. Anyway, I have also chosen to omit South Carolina and Louisiana from this study. Records relating to racial identity in these states are voluminous, and many such cases are connected to the urban cultures of Charleston and New Orleans. These two cities, along with Mobile, Alabama, and Savannah, Georgia, to some degree, more formally recognized an intermediate class between black and white, thereby adding another and quite different dimension to the issue of sex across the color line. Pardon. All right, check, check. Woo, going too hard. Going too hard. Right, check, check. All right, all right. Let's go. Let's go. All right, water break, water break. All right, so let's continue. Let's continue here. So, stories about sex between white women and black men in South Carolina and Louisiana would doubtless introduce further complexities to the conclusions drawn here. Nonetheless, although the men and women involved in the stories I relate lived in various regions, there is no easily apparent pattern to determine a particular community's response to a liaison between a white woman and a black man. Some of the white women came from poor landless families. Others were members of the small slaveholding yeomanry. Some of the black men belonged to wealthy masters. Others belonged to masters who farmed with the assistance of a few slaves, and still others were free. A few of the white women hailed from families with considerable wealth, and one of the black men was himself a slave owner in the midst of the Black Belt. Although each major case came to light as an isolated historical event, I have followed every discovery by researching the surrounding context through censuses, wills, inventories, local histories, and other relevant documents. Yet the records of all that came to pass before the transgressions were revealed in written documents are few to none. In order to recreate the worlds of the historical actors, then I have had to ask and sometimes to beg men and women to reveal their lives through such elusive evidence as the self righteous court testimony of racist villagers. In fiction, an author can alert a reader how to view a narrator, as in William Faulkner's Shakespearean reference to a tale told by an idiot in The Sound and the Fury. County court records, however, do not come labeled with such clues as a version told by the sanctimonious white elite townspeople. After coaxing information from the documents and casting a critical eye on different points of view, I had to refrain from smoothing over the inconsistencies, indeed, the incoherence in the stories I had heard. Hence, the importance of the language of speculation, even uncertainty, in the writing of a social history such as this one. Perhaps, presumably, possibly, plausibly, these words have been constant companions, as have such phrases as, there is no way to know, it has proven impossible to discover, the evidence is not conclusive, and if the story is true. As for true stories, I haven't assumed that only those historical actors with whom I sympathize were the truth tellers. Some who commanded my sympathy turned out to be liars. I have had to ask why a particular person told his or her story in a particular way. To do so, I have had to invert the narratives of the powerful to find the stories of the voiceless. For the most part, the powerless spoke only because they were forced to come forward, though not necessarily without a certain resistance that is evident in their very words. I have tried throughout to reconstruct the stories that various people told themselves and each other as events unfolded, alongside the narratives of those who observed and judged the transgressors. I have attempted to discern the experiences of the white women and black men who defied taboos and the ways they sought to explain their actions. Because white people had courtroom privileges and because black families were not legally recognized under slavery, antebellum cases were defined largely in terms of the white participants. Not only did the family status of the black men play no part in the outcome, but the lives of the men, except for their status as slave or free, are scarcely described in the documents. As for retelling the stories, historians must contend with the difficulties of memory and the reconstruction of even the near past. Sometimes the archival voices here belong to a participant or an eyewitness, though more often they belonged to someone who conversed with an eyewitness or who had simply listened to local gossip. Rather than presenting verbatim disclosures and declarations, therefore, documents often reveal only what someone thought someone else had said. In turn, eyewitnesses could reshape what they had seen or heard according to new information, suasion, bias, forgetfulness, or any other number of other influences. And of course, my own standpoint has shaped the stories in these pages as well. So basically, what she's trying to say here is that it takes a little bit of reading in between the lines of these documents and stories from these legal documents to figure out what actually happened, right? Because, people are going to give one account and this person might lie, of course, in a courtroom. This person might tell half of the truth because they're trying to make themselves seem innocent. But you have to look at the framework, right? Like she's about to tell the story of a wealthy white woman who slept with a black man during slavery. And now she's going to try to read in between the lines of this white woman's account of this sexual relationship she had with this black man to figure out what really went down. The white woman might have claimed rape, but what really was the dynamic between them that caused them to be in this predicament? So Ozzy says, black slave owner. What the hell? Yeah. So there were black people who owned slaves during the time of slavery, of course. In Louisiana, there were many people who were, the sons of like slave masters. Sometimes the slave master would let that son go free, even though he was half black. And the slave master would then give his son like some land, some money, some privileges, some property to then start buying his own slaves and create his own plantation. I mean, that's just Louisiana, right? And several other cases. But more often than not, black people would buy other black people out of slavery to then let them live with them, right? Like there are stories of black people who bought their family out of slavery and kept their family as technically slaves, but that was to protect them from being enslaved from another white family or another white slave master. So yes, there are black people who own slaves, unfortunately. I mean, we've always had COONs, right? But there are also a lot of stories of black people buying other black people out for their freedom, right? Continuing here in the story. So, Questions of motivations and emotions have ultimately proved the most resistant, both to documentation and to imagination. It is not always clear, for example, whether sexual intimacy was brief or protracted. I therefore use the word liaison more often than relationship because it allows for greater ambiguity of time span, reasons, and feelings. Although white Southerners sometimes referred to white women who had sex with black men as prostitutes, I have chosen to omit the formal category of prostitution, defined as a transaction of sex for material compensation. The documents do attest to the fact that white women and black men who formed sexual liaisons, either ongoing or brief, were not always, or perhaps ever, forming alliances against the white patriarchs of the South. To be sure, there are records of white women and black men who talked back to authorities, professed love, and leveled counter accusations at white men. Yet, whether rebellion, revenge, defiance, strategy, desire, or love played a role, the dynamics of power between white women and black men were ultimately too complicated by race, gender, sexuality, and class to permit simple bonds against white men. White women, even very poor ones, had more choices than most black men, either slave or free, in the antebellum South. And this granted the women at least a small measure of power as well as a stake in racial slavery. More well to do white women, even those who may have despised the white men who ruled them, rarely, if ever, challenged the authority of whiteness, for they most certainly had a stake in the system. Indeed, some documents offer evidence that white women in the slave South, no matter what their class standing, could coerce black men into sex. In the post-Civil War cases, the problems of motivations and emotions takes on new contours. At that point, it is often impossible to distinguish between liaisons that had come to pass, alleged liaisons, and forced and false confessions. These questions raise related questions about agency. In sum, although the transgressors here may have demonstrated resistance, they were also often powerless. In lieu of clear evidence about motivations, emotions, and agency, I have instead tried to place the words and deeds of authorities, neighbors, and transgressors in dialogue with surrounding laws, taboos, culture, and history. What follows is intended to be inquiring and exploratory rather than definitive and conclusive, and more work remains to be done on the issues raised here. The stories told and retold in the following pages are not merely the miserable chronicles of obscure villages. The events may be compelling on their own, but they are also historically significant. These stories begin to illuminate the historical construction of a particularly powerful category of illicit sex in American history. All right. So yeah, basically what she's trying to say here at the end of chapter 1 is essentially like this history, these stories are so like lost to time and only fragments of these stories remain that she's sort of like piecing the puzzles back together, doing some like, intuitive thinking and also like reading in between the lines of the context of these legal documents to basically reconstruct these events that have happened so long ago and then were so fleeting that it takes a lot of deduction to sort of figure them out. And that's the point she's trying to get at here. So we're going to finish right here. And we'll start here in tomorrow's live stream reading, part 1, neighborhood dramas, 2, marriage, Nell Butler and Charles. So I guess this is the marriage between a white woman and a black man before slavery and before the end of slavery. And we'll figure this out. So let me know what you think about this book. Let me know what you think about this story. And if you have any other books that you want me to read for the Book React series, let me know. Put them in the chat, and we'll continue reading these stories. Y'all be easy out there, and peace.